Let's do it, do it.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Felicia Londre. I teach theater history at UMKC. And the title of my talk is Shakespeare in Love, From Prose to Poetry. I'm going to start by giving away the ending. The last line of Shakespeare in Love is, "It's a mystery." By my count, in this play, there are 6 instances when that line or a slight variation of it is spoken. Clearly, the playwright chose "it's a mystery" as a leitmotif. But what is the mystery? Is it the mystery of who was the real historical figure using the pen name Shakespeare? Unfortunately, no. That's a question for another time. See the back of your handout. Indeed, this play is not concerned with historical figures. Yes, there are some characters with the same names as some real Elizabethans who were associated with the theater. You have them on your handout to look at later if you want to. Will Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and so on. But Shakespeare in Love is not historical drama, or even historical comedy. It's a free fantasia, a postmodern pop culture riff on ye old London town light. So don't worry, since it's all fiction, you are not obliged to bring any prior knowledge to it. On a plot level, just watch the play as you would watch any farce. And yet there is something that might give you, as an audience member, a little extra shot of dopamine. And that is recognition of the dozens of quoted snippets of famous lines and other literary allusions. They're like little bones tossed to well-read audience members to make us feel smart. For example, "Out, damn Spot," is spoken to a dog named Spot. But almost everyone will recognize it as a line from Lady Macbeth's famous sleepwalking hand-washing scene. Well, you know that one. Also from the Scottish play, you'll hear a hint of a famous line that's broken up between Henslowe and Will. Henslowe asks, "When can I see Pages?" Will replies, "Tomorrow." Henslowe, "Tomorrow and?" Will, "Tomorrow." You all know that one too. Tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. Those are among the easy ones tossed out for you to fetch. The more artfully embedded bones will seem almost worth digging into your memory bank for, but maybe not, because you want to hear what they say next. And besides, this play doesn't always borrow from Shakespeare with total accuracy. For example, when Will says, "Speak it to me again, let it trip off the tongue," the echo chamber of your mind might give you the correct version of Hamlet's line, "Speak the speech I pray you as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue." Of course, it's gratifying when you get one of those little side jokes, but in the moment of the dramatic action, you're more interested in the dramatic action than in that mental doubling. It works like poetry. Something is triggered or evoked in your mind to spark a cosmic connection or a flash of enlightenment, even though you don't stop to define it or make total literal sense of it. Is that the mystery in the play? Well, close, but not quite. I will get back to the mystery. Shakespeare in Love is a comedy about language, specifically about poetry, both in terms of its plot and its theme. The initiating plot device is one we've been seeing a lot of lately. The central character is a writer with writer's block. The Unicorn's recent production of Revolutionists showed 18th century French woman writer Olympe de Gouges struggling to get her activist ideas down on paper. The Unicorn's forthcoming December production, Bernhardt Hamlet, has the legendary actress Sarah Bernhardt struggling with her translator to find the right words for her interpretation of Hamlet in French. In both Bernhardt Hamlet and a play titled Edmund that I saw in Paris last summer, poet-playwright Edmond Rostand struggles to overcome the writer's block that is holding up his progress on what would become his masterpiece, Cyrano de Bergerac. And by the way, Shakespeare in Love includes a scene you will recognize as a spoof of the most famous scene in Cyrano de Bergerac, when a language-challenged man at a loss for words woos the woman he loves by parroting the love poetry that his more accomplished accomplice improvises for him. Like those other plays, tonight's play, Shakespeare in Love, takes as a plot device the idea that a character whose very identity depends on language is blanking out. It opens with the relatively unknown novice playwright Will Shakespeare struggling to write a sonnet, but convinced that he's lost his gift for writing. A play about a writer not writing? How dramatic can that be? We already know that Will Shakespeare will manage to knock out most of the greatest plays ever written in the entire history of the world. I don't need to tell you that all's well that ends well. To be dramatic, the plot has to show how the hero overcomes his obstacle. What exciting action will transform our hero Will from not writing to writing? The play's title has already told us what transformation takes place. Shakespeare falls in love. Love inspires creativity. Passion pushes the pen. So that's the plot. On a thematic level, you can reverse that action statement. It's creativity with language that inspires love. Poetry provokes passion. A woman's love is won not by some man in the dark under her balcony, but by the very poetry itself. When we first meet Viola in Shakespeare in Love, she is enraptured by the poetry she heard in Will Shakespeare's early romance, Two Gentlemen of Verona. She says, "I will have poetry in my life." In her second scene with the Queen, she says, "I love poetry above all." As we see in Shakespeare in Love, loving poetry leads to loving the poet. The same sentiment is expressed in Eugene O'Neill's great play, Long Day's Journey into Night, about his tortured family, when the father, James Tyrone, a former actor in historical melodrama, says, "I loved Shakespeare. I would have acted in any of his plays for nothing, for the sheer joy of being alive in great poetry." There is something about elevated language in a play that expands our world, even when we don't understand every word that's spoken. The idea of making Shakespeare accessible by dumbing down the language or by translating his plays into a contemporary version is a fallacy. And I'm thinking of Oregon Shakespeare Festival's translation project. Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's own language, is accessible. And the proof of that is embedded in Shakespeare in Love. You can hear the difference between the everyday language of "speak it to me again, let it trip off the tongue," and the words that sing, "Speak the speech I pray you as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue." In the play you will hear tonight, the farcical plot advances by means of a lot of everyday language. Yes, it's funny, sometimes witty, but the play's non-Shakespearean dialogue is not poetry. Perhaps the undistinguished modern dialogue is intended as a mockery or an exposé of our century's verbal impoverishment by comparison with past ages when everybody memorized poetry. Compare, for example, how this play's Viola tells us that she grooves on poetic language. I love poetry above all. In contrast, Lady Anne expresses the same idea in Shakespeare's Richard III. My woman's heart grossly grew captive to his honey words. As the action of Shakespeare in Love progresses, you get increasing snippets and then great chunks of accurately quoted verse lines that were written by Shakespeare. The play's juxtaposition of blah modern prose with Elizabethan poetic language was surely intended to make the point. The words taken directly from Shakespeare speak to your soul more immediately and powerfully than our limited modern vocabulary. Some of you might remember a couple of decades ago the Reduced Shakespeare Company. 3 guys who did hilarious breakneck mini versions of the complete works of Shakespeare abridged. In a couple of minutes for each play, they raced through the entire canon, applying their college boy humor. But at some point, they paused the zaniness, and one of the actors would perform Hamlet's speech, "What a piece of work is a man," with total commitment for the words. The impact of that moment of respect for the writing was astounding, mesmerizing, the most memorable bit in the entire evening. What is the lesson in that? I think it's exactly what this play Shakespeare in Love is trying to show us. We need poetry. The effect of poetry on the listener beyond simple communication is part of the mystery we're pursuing. It's interesting to consider Shakespeare's language in terms of the Elizabethan soundscape, an acoustic environment that carried meanings of its own. The plays and sonnets were meant to be heard more than seen or read. Elizabethans believed that sight gave knowledge about surfaces and exteriors, while sound provided special entryway to hidden meaning and spiritual values. According to Wes Folkerth in The Sound of Shakespeare, sound was considered the most direct perceptual avenue to the soul. Shakespeare in Love draws largely upon 3 of Shakespeare's works. First, you will hear quotations from his early career comedy, Two Gentlemen of Verona. In Act 2, you will get more substantial sequences from Romeo and Juliet. In addition, the play uses his best-known and most familiar sonnet, Sonnet 18, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" It starts with a rather cheesy treatment in scene 1, but bit by bit, the lines will come together for a kind of apotheosis, one of those pause in the zaniness moments that hit you with something remarkable. The importance of that sonnet in the play was what inspired me to focus on poetry for this talk. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day" was the first Shakespeare sonnet I ever memorized. I was in high school, and while browsing among the 154 sonnets, that was the one I decided to possess. So let's just take a couple minutes to look at how an Elizabethan sonnet is put together. What most of us know about sonnets is that they are 14 lines. Sonnets can be traced back to 13th century Italy, where a 14-line poem got the name sonetto, little song. A century later, along came Petrarch, who wrote 317 sonnets to a girl named Laura. And that's why we tend to assume that the sonnet form is devoted primarily to romantic feelings. The Petrarchan Sonnet consists of an 8-line verse with a rhyme pattern of ABBA, ABBA, followed by the 6-line volta or turnaround, CDE, CDE. That pattern didn't work so well in English, which doesn't have the great wealth of rhyming words that Italian has. The English sonnet is the familiar 3 quatrains, that is 3 4-line verses, followed by the couplet to cap it off. Shakespeare's favorite rhyme scheme for his sonnets is ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, GG. Shakespeare's sonnets were published in 1609, more than 15 years later than the time of the action in Shakespeare in Love, which is set in 1593. In 1592-93, Christopher Marlowe was the most celebrated Elizabethan playwright, while Will Shakespeare was still relatively unknown. It's almost an in-joke that the play allows some latitude for thinking that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's works. Shakespeare's sonnets have long been read as love poetry, as one might expect. Some of the sonnets refer to a woman who elicits both love and exasperation in the poet. But Hank Whittemore's groundbreaking study of Shakespeare's sonnets puts forth his discovery that beneath the surface romantic quality, all of them have coded political content. His detective work finds that the exasperating woman was Queen Elizabeth herself. I will get back to that interpretation, but first let's take a closer look at one of the sonnets. We won't take Sonnet 18, since Shakespeare in Love already handles that one quite effectively. How about Sonnet 33, the third one I ever memorized? The first quatrain is, "Full many a glorious morning have I seen, flatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye, kissing with golden face the meadows green, gilding pale streams with heavenly alchemy." That quatrain sets up an idyllic landscape with the morning sun bringing golden light to the world, just as Queen Elizabeth shone so brightly over all of England. The second quatrain changes. "Anon, permit the baser cloud to ride, with ugly rack on his celestial face, and from the forlorn world his visage hide, stealing unseen to west with this disgrace. Just as a sunny day will sometimes cloud over, there will be occasional dark days when the sun's brilliance is obscured, whether it be in terms of the weather, or some clouding over of a love relationship that suffers a setback, or Queen Elizabeth having a bad hair day, or England itself experiencing crop failures or foreign meddling." And by the way, disgrace did not necessarily mean shame. The original meaning of disgrace was a blemish on beauty. Well, those first two quatrains set the scene for what the poet really wants to say in the third quatrain, where it gets personal. "Even so, my sun one early morn did shine, with all triumphant splendor on my brow. Alack, he was but 1 hour mine, the region's sun hath masked him from me now." Most scholars read those lines as being about a disappointment in love. They interpret "my sun" as being my day of being happy in love, and now it's over. But like the first two quatrains, these third quatrain lines allow multiple superimposed interpretations. To me, Sonnet 33 is very clearly and literally autobiographical, since I know that the author was Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, who was once a favorite at court, but fell out of favor with the Queen and was banished from court for a couple of years. He looks back on his glory days, as many of us do when we look back on the productive peak of our careers that went by so quickly, but 1 hour mine, after which the poet has kept going less visibly, as if masked by a cloud. The couplet says that the poet recognizes that the world is full of setbacks and he can rise above them. Yet him for this, my love, no whit disdaineth. Sons of the world may stain when heaven's sun staineth. We don't have time for details, but let me offer a brief summary of Hank Whittemore's understanding of how Sonnet 33 exemplifies the issues treated in all 154 sonnets, showing his insights showing a political layer beneath the formulaic surface of romantic love poetry, grew out of the Prince Tudor theory that Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, to whom the sonnets are dedicated, was the love child of the sonnet's author, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, and the so-called virgin queen, Elizabeth I. The 3rd Earl of Southampton was born in 1573, at a time when Oxford was especially favored by the Queen, and court gossip speculated about an affair between the brilliant young Oxford and the 16-year-older Queen. For a couple of months in 1573, at about the time Southampton was born, the Queen was in seclusion. And of course, she always wore big dresses anyway. Not long afterward, the Countess of Southampton came up with a baby boy, even though her husband had been in prison 9 months earlier. As young Southampton grew into adulthood, his father began writing the sonnets, the first 17 of which urge him to marry and have children, so that his beauty will not be lost to the world. Substitute royal bloodline for beauty, and all 154 sonnets, and everything clicks into place. There was nobody other than Southampton who could continue the Tudor bloodline. The poet obliquely expresses his discontent that the Queen refused to acknowledge Southampton as her son and heir. But the poet could not say so directly because it was forbidden, in fact treasonous, to bring up the subject of succession to the throne. In the next group of sonnets, the poet consoles himself that the sonnets themselves will have to immortalize the younger man. Sonnet 33 was among those written after Southampton was arrested on February 8, 1601, for his part in the failed Essex Rebellion. Essex and the others were tried and executed. These sonnets may be read as a father's pleading that his son's life be spared. Although Southampton was not executed, he was stripped of his title and could never become king. He remained in prison for 3 years until after James I had succeeded to the throne. In Sonnet 33, the line, "From the forlorn world his visage hide," refers not only to the sun sinking in the west, but the father's anguish when his son is hidden away in prison. Who had the power to release Southampton and restore his title, but didn't do it? "The region cloud hath masked him from me now." Whittemore notes that region is a close anagram for Regina, the queen. Shakespeare's sonnets have been called the greatest puzzle in the English language. And that's because we cannot fully know the human story that is hinted at or lurks beneath the surface in them. Yes, there is a mystery about the content of the sonnets, but now it's time to return to the mystery that's invoked in Shakespeare in Love, to finish off. Since the phrase, "it's a mystery," is most often uttered by Henslowe, who's a businessman, it's clear that he has to trust the mystery enough to risk real money on it. Henslowe has seen that if you start with a big empty stage and let the artist muddle through what looks like chaos, suddenly you have people in a story that plucks at your heart in a way that fulfills an audience's need. So the mystery clearly has something to do with the creative process. Why is a writer or any artist sometimes stymied? What happens in the artist's mind or life to end the blockage and release the creativity? In an intense life experience, like love, is the ultimate spur to heightened artistic expression? And when we need to express love, why do we abandon clear, common sense, everyday language and switch to the sometimes baffling or ambiguous language of poetry? When language is transmuted into poetry, why are we lifted out of our petty selves and tuned in with a more cosmic sense of the world? Those questions, I think, suggest the nature of the play's mystery that cannot be fully explained, the mystery of creative artistry. I'd like to end with the last 3 verses from a modern poem by Edward Hirsch, because it evokes the artist's pursuit of the elusive art of poetry. Never mind that it doesn't literally solve the mystery of what makes art happen. After all, the nature of poetry is to open up new vistas rather than tie you down to the literal. Hirsch's poem is titled To Poetry, and it is addressed to poetry itself. Does anyone still invoke the muse, string a wooden lyre for Apollo, or try to saddle up Pegasus? Winged horse, heavenly god or goddess, indifferent entity, secret codes, stored magic, pleasance and half wonder, hell. I have loved you my entire life without even knowing what you are or how. Please help me to find you. Looks like I left you only 4 minutes in case you have any questions. And of course, if you didn't get a handout, please stop by and get one afterward. Any questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the show. And I have handouts for anyone who didn't get one.